Hello, friends. Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm your host, Zen Garcia.
Revolution Radio.
Most are afraid of unknown depths, skirting shores thinking world flat. And with the island girls in celebration of new religion. Nobody led me or said this way. I sailed alone on makeshift raft with wind as companion. Fate for deliverance, confidence enough to assess new disposition. Seekers of lost paradise may seem fools to those who never sought the other world. Welcome to Momentary Zen with Zen Garcia. Visit www.fallenangels.tv. You're listening to Revolution Radio.
Hello, friends, readers, listeners, and viewers from across America and around the world. I'm your host, Zen Garcia. This is Momentary Zen here on Revolution Radio, and it's always a great honor and a pleasure to be with you and to join in fellowship to talk about all things esoteric. I'm joined this evening by my guest, Lee Minnick, who is the author of The Forbidden History of America. Lee, are you there?
Yes, indeed, I am, Zen.
All right, great. Well, thanks for joining us this evening and giving us this opportunity to talk about your work and your efforts. And if you would, share your social media stuff, anything that you'd like, YouTube, Facebook, email addresses, where people can go to find your work, that kind of stuff.
Certainly. First of all, thank you very much for even having me. Actually, I need to thank you twice, sir. So thank you for, first of all, picking up the book, for even allowing Forbidden History on Sacred Word Publishing. It is a tremendous honor. But then thank you again for having me on tonight to have this discussion with you about something that I'm quite passionate about, which is our past. So I do have a Forbidden History Facebook page. The website is not up and running quite yet. It's been a busy season of late, but it should be hopefully coming and will be posted on the Facebook page. And I'm also on Discord and in various rooms, so I will try to get the word out when the website is up and running.
All right, excellent. Do you do any YouTubes or anything of that nature?
I do have a separate YouTube channel that's sort of a personal channel. It's not related to the book at all.
Right on.
But I've been toying with the idea of starting a separate YouTube channel specifically for perhaps either some narrations or discussions about forbidden history.
Yeah, maybe because the book is quite extensive, and you're a prolific writer, so I'm thinking that there's got to be a lot of intriguing, stories that you could break down individually into, selective narratives, and that might be a way to share just the interesting things you've come across, because
absolutely,
I know myself.
I actually left a whole lot out.
Yeah. Well, are you working on a follow-up or another?
I am working on another work. It's not American history based work, but yeah, the publishers that I had been sort of in discussion with, there was a couple of separate publishers that were interested in it. They wanted to break it up into various volumes, at least 2 to 3 volumes, because of its size. And anybody who's obviously got it knows it's it's ginormous. It's quite the paperweight. But yeah, and I'd even left out some various aspects of American history that I was very fascinated and wanted to include, like the Old West, the copper barons, the railroad barons, and things of that nature that I felt like just weren't going to be able to drive the narrative that I was aiming for. So I chose to exclude some of that. But it's a good suggestion that maybe those types of discussions could be had on a YouTube channel.
Yeah, at least create more interest for your work and stuff. But anyways, let's talk a little bit about what brought you to awakening, as far as the New World Order type of stuff, because it seems like everybody now is face to face with all of that, with all of what's going on in the world, and like no matter if you were an unbeliever, in regard to conspiracy stuff, or any of that previously, it's now all in your face, and so people are having to contend with things that they might not have otherwise done so previously. But just talk about kind of what led you into the work of the book, and what drove your interest, and what brought you to even consider the kind of things that you write about.
Sure. Well, I grew up in central Pennsylvania, so I had history sort of all around me from early on. And, come high school, I went with a friend of mine to go see the film Gettysburg, which is based off of a historical fiction work by Michael Shara, hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, called Killer Angels. And it was all about the 3-day Battle of Gettysburg. And, I spent my weekends in high school sort of going and visiting there and just walking the battlefields. And it's just always very fascinating to me to reflect on what happened in certain places. And, it is just a historically rich area to grow up in. But I would say if you fast forward to mid 2000s, I found myself for the first time actually paying attention to American politics. And I found myself sort of in this weird, interesting space where I started to wonder, the more I paid attention to political matters that were in current events, of just wanting to know what happened, what brought us to this place, where I, woke up in my mid-20s wondering, how did we get here? What happened with, everything? And I read the Civil War trilogies by the Jeff and Michael Shara, and that sort of just kicked off and sparked a passion to want to start consuming more historical literature, and particularly biographies. So I started reading a lot of biographies of the founding fathers, and just the more I consumed Zen, the more it just felt like history was not what I was taught in public school.
Right. Yeah.
We're kind of taught, and it's portrayed in this old, boring, it's dry, it's nothing but a bunch of names of dead people and dates and blah blah. It's nothing. You're just move along, nothing interesting to see here type of thing. But I started to discover in self-study the very opposite. I found the truth far more interesting than fiction. And I just started consuming in mass book after book after book of different historical time periods. The Revolutionary War, the Civil War was probably the one I was most passionate about, but also, various conflicts. The reason why Forbidden History was sort of written as a narrative that is centered around our various conflicts, Zen, is because I feel like that those pivotal moments in our American past is where we as a society and culture sort of underwent and undergone the most shifts, if you will, changes, different changes of course, if you will. Those various storms battered our ship to go different directions in various ways. But so I did that, and then come fast forward mid 2000s, I sort of worked a bunch of jobs, various seasonal jobs and part-time jobs, and I always prayed that, Father, please give me a full-time year-round position that's got decent pay that I can support a family on. And for some odd reason, it never happened. I worked a lot of really cool jobs, but I was a jack of all trades and sort of a master of none. And I finally landed one in about 2014 and climbed up the corporate ladder fairly quickly. But the weird thing then was when I blinked 3.5 years later and found myself completely dissatisfied with what I was doing, which is really weird because, it's kind of odd to have an answer to prayer where I've got a full-time job, year-round job with decent pay. My wife and I were making more money than we've ever made before, but there is this weird occurrence that sort of started to tickle the background in 2017 that I couldn't put my finger on. The best way I can describe it, Zen, is it felt like a midlife crisis without the crisis. It was just this undercurrent of nag of something. I'm not doing what my creator put me on this earth to do type of feeling.
Yeah.
But I could never, I could never come to grips with that as far as what that meant and what to do about it. But it was always there.
How old are you?
I'm 43, okay. Excuse me.
Right on. Yeah, because a lot of times, it's the early 20s that you are starting to develop self-identity and to try to create whatever that is for yourself. And when you start to reach the 30s and 40s, it's like you have a feeling of what it is that you want to do and a greater purpose. Like there's something inherently that you might love and that you feel like passionate about. And a lot of people ignore this all their lives, and end up doing something that just it becomes mindless and like just a zombified something they go through. They're not passionate about, but for those that are lucky enough to listen to and to hear that, it's a great blessing, I believe, to be able to find what is your life's work, to identify that and to move on it and to follow that. But anyways, I was just wondering. So, but continue.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely correct that I think we all at various stages in our life can find ourselves stuck in ruts of not knowing how to catapult ourselves out of them. And heaven knows I've had many. That was just one of the bigger ones, I guess you could say, where you feel like you're just sort of not satisfied with what you're doing. And you're correct about what you say about trying to find identity in your 20s. Mine was bouncing all over the country, working jobs on the beach in North Myrtle, South Carolina, to working on dude guest ranches in Montana. And, my family probably thought I was nuts. They wrote that song, Lord, I was born a rambling man, after me.
Right.
That was me through my whole 20s, pretty much. But it was very odd how 2017 rolled around. I'm perfectly happy or was happy with doing what I was doing. But there was just, the best way I can describe it, Zen, is there's a quote from a great book by Stephen Ambrose, one of my favorite historians, in a book called Undaunted Courage. And it's all about the core of discovery, about Meriwether Lewis and Captain Clark's voyage across the Rocky Mountains and to try and find a Northwest Passage. But in this book, there's a really interesting passage where Meriwether Lewis wrote, quote, "This day I completed my 31st year. I reflected that I had as yet done but little, very little indeed, to further the happiness of the human race or to advance the information of the succeeding generation. I viewed with regret the many hours I have spent in indolence and now sorely feel the want of that information which those hours would have given me had they been judiciously expended." And then he resolved, in quote, "In future, to live for mankind as I have heretofore lived for myself, end quote. So he wrote
Right
that when he completed his 31st year. Ironically, in this book, it's on page 31. But
on.
that's kind of the best way I could describe it, you know, where I
Yeah,
felt like
yeah.
I didn't have children, but I'm going, you know, most people kind of find this, I guess, sense of fulfillment in their children. I had something that I felt like I needed to do, but I didn't know what that was. And so a very interesting series of events began to play out. I will not bore you with them here and now, or your listeners, throughout the summer of 2017. And basically, under the coaxing of my wife and sort of just in prayer asking, I need something, Father, a door of some kind to open up to show me that this is what you want me to do, which is walk away from the corporate retail world, which it didn't make any sense to do. I had prayed that whole year of, you need to give me another job of some kind if I'm going to quit this one, because it didn't seem like the adult thing, responsible thing to do. But ironically, I ended up finding a gentleman, a retired lieutenant colonel out of Texas, who had a volunteer organization called Truth in Textbooks. And I had been a substitute teacher for several years in two different states in various different age school and just subjects of all kind. And he ended up, ironically, I was supposed to be walking my dog because I was working that day, but for some odd reason I got delayed, and I caught this guy on the local talk radio station here talking about him and his organization, where he's got a team of volunteer social study and history textbook reviewers. And what they basically do, Zen, is these various school districts will submit these textbooks from these publishers to this group. And their reviewers are responsible for basically reviewing them and, as a team, coming up with any inconsistencies, any falsifications or sort of biases or outright, false facts or what have you. And I heard him, and I ended up giving him a call. Graciously, he was on the way to the airport, and he said he'd call me back, which he did. And we spent about an hour on the phone, and I basically told him I think I could contribute to your organization, your volunteer group there. And that's what I started to do. I basically walked away from the retail world and started to read or be a volunteer textbook reviewer. At the same time, I actually started forcing myself to read a book called Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States of America.
Yeah.
And I tried, when I substitute taught Zen, I would see that book on almost every single social study history teacher's book shelves or next to their desk. And I would see this and I would pick it up. I would try to read a chapter or two of it, and I never could do it. I kept trying, but I couldn't do it because I don't want to, talk smack on other people's work, but it was something that confused me. Well, I ended up in Barnes and Noble with my wife one day, and I said, and this was after I walked away and I started doing the textbook reviewer thing. And I said, if I'm going to talk smack on this book, I better at least read it. So I bought it, and I endeavored to myself, I was going to actually make it from cover to cover. Well, by the end of it, I ended up with page after page after page after page of notes. I could probably publish a whole new pamphlet refuting that book based off of all the various pages of my notes and commentary on what I read in that book. And I guess, I probably complained Zen one too many times to my wife of, man, this stuff is just, I wish somebody would write the history book that I wished, I could have found and read from start to finish. And she's like, well, you've got the time now. Why don't you do it? I'm like, I've never written anything before. So at her prompting and others, I guess I decided to, I just started writing. It's basically what I did. So the majority of the book then is centered from 1776 and the Revolution till present day. I do touch in the first chapter briefly, a touch and go on some pre-Columbian history, but that's kind of how it all went down. And here we are after it actually took a heck of a lot longer to publish the sucker than it did to even write it. I think I wrote it in in about 6 to 8 months, at least the majority of it, because I started building our house in Montana, and then had to sort of split time between doing that and trying to complete the final couple of chapters there. But.
Yeah, I remember also myself that when I started to read the Bible and to read the extra biblical texts in a manner that, I had cut off all the outside judgments, biases, and opinions of everybody else and just read it for myself, that I kept seeing things, and I would write down copious amounts of notes and stuff just like yourself, and I realized that there was so many themes that kept presenting themselves to me that nobody was speaking about, and that was my exact endeavor, was to share all these things that I had learned about things like the fruit in the garden and all of that, and the bloodline war and all these different things, but because nobody was seeing it, I had to do it myself, in the same way that you found yourself applying all your notes to your work and material as well. So, but let's go into it. Tell us about some of the things that you learned, you discovered, the forbidden history, some of the things that intrigued you, and how things are not as we've been taught in school.
Yeah, exactly right. And I mean, these people's stories, Zen, that are echoed in our past, it's not something that they're gonna just give us. We have to go like you did with the apocryphal works and other things that you were mentioning, which ironically, while I was writing the book, I also started for the first time reading Enoch and Yasher Jubilees and diving into the same material as well. But the thing is we have to embark in self-study to try and dig out the truth, because, as I'm sure you would admit, it's all a mixture. There's lies and there's truths. In fact, I think it was Adlon Childs may have been, I don't know if it originated with him, but I heard him say something to the effect of, mutilated truths make for the most convincing of lies. And as I stated before, I think there is a very specific reason why they have to paint our past in history in general as boring, because we know we are going to repeat said past if we are not cognitively aware of that past. So I guess that's kind of, Zen, where I found myself. A huge event happened during actually something happened in July of 2017, but then something else on the exact day of the solar eclipse. And I found myself basically in a mindset of, well, back then I thought we could save this sinking ship. and that's been slightly adjusted in certain ways since, but I thought if somebody could, if I could paint our past in such a way that would make it interesting, that would hopefully plant enough seeds in the mind of a reader to want to go do their own digging and their own investigation and their own personal study, like you said, Zen, you find it starts to mean more. And you also find that it becomes something where you start being able to pick apart the lies from the truth, or at least you start getting, like you said, inclinations of things maybe not being what they seem. And yeah, it's just it was just one of those things where I felt like there was a story to tell, a book that I wished I had been able to read in my mid-20s back in 2007 that I found by 10 years later needed to be written. So I attempted it. My attempt was to write a narrative that was every bit as factual as what you would find, but hopefully told in such a way that is far more interesting, because these people's lives, what happened in these occurrences, are anything but boring. It's actually fascinating to see how these time periods and these conflicts and various things would steer us in a very particular direction. And that was kind of one thing that, I tried to write about in the book, is if we were guilty as a society of once upon a time painting our past in this sort of spotless, glowing, flowery, patriotic vein where, basically we could do no wrong. We cracked gold bars, and basically our government, our country was just the best thing since sliced bread. Now it seems, at least from what I'm noticing, since I became a textbook reviewer, popping up a lot, is this self-loathing, self-condemning, self-hatred type of. It's like that pendulum Zen has swung from the one position to the opposite and equal 180 position, And the problem is neither is truth, and at least in my study and from my personal opinion, from everything that I have learned over the decades of consuming the amount of books that I have about all of this stuff, is neither one's quite on point of the truth. There's a whole lot of gray area with history. And I guess, somewhere in between those two views might lie the truth. But
well, share with us some facts.
Well, it's kind of interesting to read through how we were even founded. There's obviously a group of men that some people claim they're all evil. Some people claim they're all saints. I tend to not fall in either camp. I think where you have a group of human beings collected, you're going to find some good ones and some rotten ones,
Of
but
course, yeah.
One thing you say what you want about their motives. These guys knew their history. These people were not ignorant to our historical past. They studied antiquity, and they knew what worked and what didn't work throughout the annals of time. And so obviously there's some that would say the revolution was being guided by a nefarious force. I tend to see that there was both good and evil at play, both then and throughout our history since.
So we're talking about the Masons?
Sure, but the thing is from my research, Zen, the Freemasonry of now isn't the same from what I've sort of seen then, meaning the Masonic lodges of America, from what I've gathered, and I could be wrong on this. I am not a Mason. I'm not an authority on Freemasonry. But obviously there was a Freemasonry presence in America during its founding. But
Yes.
From what I've researched, it was a very different type of social club, if you will, boys club, if you will. It didn't really become what it is now until it was heavily infiltrated by certain nefarious sects. I guess you'd call them Illuminati. But from my research, that didn't happen until sometime around Jackson's presidency, and maybe immediately after is when the Masonic lodges in America began to become infiltrated by this other sect of European secret societies, if you will. And I'm not saying they were all saints either. There are certain characters. Benjamin Franklin's ties with the Hellfire Club, and I think Alexander Hamilton could even fit into that category of some of our founding fathers that may have had some very interesting, colorful pasts that you almost scratch your head and you don't know even what to make of it, because it's hidden under a whole patchwork quilt of obfuscation in certain regards. But
right. Yes.
At the end of the day, all I've managed to do is just read a pile of biographies on some of these individuals and just make a guy's own assessment on what it all looks like. I will say that there are certain founding fathers, Washington probably being chief amongst them, that it seems the enemy's latched onto to try and pervert. Now, I didn't know the guy. I'm not going to say factually one way or another, but what I will say is if he was an evil, nefarious little critter, his actions didn't quite show it much. Lincoln stole it from Messiah when he said that a house divided against itself can't stand, and obviously we know Messiah said how does demons cast out demons type of thing. Right, so if some of my whole point then is if some of these people were rotten to the core and evil and nefarious, I struggle to see it in what I have read of their writings and read of their speeches and what they did. It's just some of it doesn't add up and make a whole lot of sense. But yeah, there's just all sorts of really cool stories about these people and what they did, and then obviously the independence was having been won, and now they're left with this big pile of mess because we were 13 colonies. The Articles of Confederation were a mess because basically you had 13 separate little countries trying to run each other in their own individual way. And the founders knew enough to know that, hey, this is never going to work. We are going to, it's just a matter of time before Britain or France or somebody's going to come in and just like take us out in piecemeal if we're not going to be unified on some front by having 13 separate economies and 13 different, financial systems and all this other stuff. So they sort of tricked the colonies into coming together to quote unquote revamp the Articles of Confederation, which Washington and maybe a couple of others knew that the real goal, the real idea was to try and draft an entirely new system that would involve, a unification of the colonies when it came to international affairs. But for the most part, they were still going to be independent and separately run as states, not as the whole idea of the entire country being run from a Washington, D.C. was sort of not even in existence then. And this is one thing that I hope that can be corrected, is there's a bunch of sort of armchair historians out there trying to basically paint our distant past as being nothing that dissimilar from our current day modern country and society, and nothing could be further from the truth, at least from my studies, is that this stuff organically began to change over a long period of time. And as we see in people, I'm sure you would agree, Zen, that just like people can be slowly corrupted by the enemy over time, so can nations. And
Yeah.
I tend to think that even if there was some nefarious plans in place for us eventually at the time, I think there was some genuine goal to try and create a society that was going to allow people the maximum amount of freedom to live as individuals the way Father created us, because we weren't created in groups. Last I checked my Genesis. And that seems to be the model that these guys were trying to create and come up with, which is why then they had to bring everybody back to the Articles of Confederation revamping session in Philadelphia. And over the course of 3 very sweaty, hot months, they tried to hash out a new document, which was the Constitution, which the Vatican then in turn in the early 1800s at their Congress of Vienna they basically called the 2 founding documents, both the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, satanic documents, which they basically at the Congress of Vienna made it their goal then to destroy our government through infiltration, subversion, and the enemy's patient. And here we are. Just say that.
Let me comment on this, because idealistically, the Freemasons and the Masonic secret societies, the mystery schools, they present a humanistic, idealistic front that is really seems to be for the goodwill and benefit of all those, especially that are inclusive within these particular organizations. And the nefarious aspect is only at the highest levels, and it's usually not ever even known about by the majority of those that are involved with the workings of the secret societies. It's just like, here we have the Shriners and like St. Jude's and things like that, where they do a lot of good work. They provide, all these hospitals for kids that the parents never have to pay. They're raising money and in boots out on every, corner where people are driving through, and they can give their change, and all of this seems to be going to do really beautiful community type work and to help people, and that is, of course, the front that everybody sees and that everybody comes to know. And it's only, again, at the very top, like even what we see on our American currency with the eye at the top of the Illuminati pyramid, the whole theme of the biblical, we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against, the wickedness in high places, um, the powers, the principalities, the rulers of darkness. And so that's the part nobody ever sees, or nobody ever knows about. And truly, Satan is behind all of these different thieves, even the idealistic, because of the push for the New World Order, the One World Order, the uh, what we have now as a one world economic, religious, political institution. All this has taken very long time to create, to implement, um, to bring to where we are now, and it's still even being worked on. But you can't have people support something unless it's idealistically seems to be beneficial for the everybody. And so that has always been the way that Satan works, is that he will present a plan that seemingly is good until he gets total domination and total power to where he can rule with impunity, and then it doesn't matter, and then he can you know bring on the war against the saints, that kind of thing. But um even, I mean, this goes way past, like, everybody believes that the Illuminati were created in 1776, and that is the story that we receive with Adam Weishaupt and all of this. But truly, it goes back even further. I mean, we're talking about even before the creation of Adam and Eve, that the Illuminati, so-called, this goes back to the fall of the angels and to Lucifer's rebellion against the Most High, where he says, "I want to exalt my throne above the stars and the clouds of God. I will create my throne, and I will be like the Most High." So his whole, even his thought back then, was to subvert the worship to himself, and to dupe and to lead astray humanity, which is why in Revelation 12 he's called that an ancient dragon, that old serpent who deceiveth the whole world, that he is the Masonic sun god. Even throughout the ages, we see that the Eye of Ra is the same thing as what we see above the Masonic pyramid on our money. But most people never understand that portion of the war. They never get to the point where that ugliness brings itself out to where you can understand um, how it is that truly he is leading this particular movement and the organization of it. And even how the we see that the protocols, which is something that we're going through, that this was a plan that was organized by the princes and the kings and the queens and the royalty, those that were already ruling over the nations, sitting on the thrones of the world, and that they are interactive with Satan in the way that the saints were and the prophets were interactive with the Most High God. But again, this is an aspect of world history and an aspect of what is going on behind the scenes, the odds behind the mask, that most people don't know about and never are able to pinpoint or understand, because little is known about this side of the history of the world. And it takes the insiders, those people that are part of the Council of the 13, that do, blood sacrifice and things of that, take blood oaths to worship Satan in a manner that is abomination to us. It takes the whistleblowers of those high level Luciferian type organizations to really bring out the truth of what is behind the agenda of the New World Order and things of that nature. And so, but for most of the world, we're not privy to that. And it's only really been since recently that this kind of information has come out. And the people that have ever spoken about that, even in the protocols and in the Illuminati secret covenant, it says that these people will be targeted. They will be murdered. Yahushua even said that, the seed of Cain, that they were the murderers of the prophets from the time of the garden to the time of Zacharias, who was the father of John the Baptist, killed in the Holy of Holies. And so, um, this is why also we have in the scriptures this kind of revelation as to what is going on behind the scenes that we're not knowledgeable about, that we're not privy to. But I fully understand, what you were talking about, where you're coming from, because yeah, I do believe that a lot of the people, even high level, presidents, statesmen, senators, representatives, they may not have even been highly involved in things like the Hellfire Club, and that were only thought of it as a gentleman's group or whatever. And they were really good people. Like, I really believe George Washington was a good person and a good man, and that, he was a hero for this nation, and that his involvement with the Illuminati was not in a devilish aspect as, that others may have been involved in.
And maybe that's why he's a target of the enemy, to have his legacy and memory completely perverted.
Yes,
and that's why they're depicting him in full Masonic regalia and paintings, that he absolutely came forward and declined the artist's multiple authors or offers. This artist hounded the elderly senior citizen. I mean, this dude was old, man, and he's getting hounded by this artist to paint this rendering, this painting of him in his Masonic garb, and he shot him down repeatedly. And it wasn't until after
him to be the poster boy.
Yes.
Of the order.
Yes. That's why they put him on the apotheosis on the dome. Absolutely.
Yes, exactly. Right. All right. But anyways, please continue. Sure.
But you're absolutely correct that we had war declared on us, both as a people, as a society, and a nation. No sooner had we fired the last shot with Great Britain in '76, and the nefarious ones that have their central hub in a particular Italian place, we won't name them, but their order starts with the 10th letter of the alphabet, declared war, outright war on us. And as you say, Zen, that they're not always going to come with swords and bullets. Sometimes they got to paint that nice public facade in order to earn people's trust. You can't get somebody to take a bite into an apple if it's clearly rotten. They have to polish that sucker up and make the exterior and visual aspect of it look really nice and sweet. It's only until after you've taken a big crunch you realize that it's completely filthy. But that's, to my understanding, that's why you see all of these good public outward, and they never fail to boast about it, which is key, these outward works by certain groups like the Shriners and others.
Right.
And who doesn't love doing good for children, for crying out loud? But the thing is they, there's a great quote in that film Captain America by a guy named Baron Zemo, where he says, "An empire toppled by its enemies can rise again, but a nation that crumbles from within, now that is dead, truly forever." All right. I may be butchering the quote, but the whole point is, we see time and again, and this is proven far beyond or behind 1776, where the enemy and his agents try to get us to turn against ourselves, turn against each other, because it's more economical that way. Why try to murder somebody if you can convince them to murder themselves? You don't even have to lift a finger. And that's kind of what the enemy's MO is all about, doing with both people and nations, is cultivating, whether quickly or slowly, whatever fits his agenda at that moment or through the decades and across the generations. He's going to implant this seed of self-hatred, which is what we're seeing now with various Marxist, leftist movements, is this seed of self-hatred. It actually even goes beyond the left. There's people elsewhere that want to try and convince the masses that we're evil, we've always been evil, and it's better if we just go away, which is kind of a scary aspect for the rest of the world, given that the rest of the world has literally flocked here to try and be left alone,
Yeah.
to be able to worship as they see fit. And
Right,
obviously we could get into discussions about various sort of things that have happened with their mangling of the Constitution ever since. But yeah, the thing is that they had to try and figure out ways, Zen, as I'm sure you well know, and I'm probably preaching to the choir with your listeners here, but they had to figure out ways to get our leaders, ourselves, and various things to almost self-destruct, if you will. That's why it's almost sad that during that constitutional convention, Zen, everybody was so hyper-focused and laser pointed on the executive branch of this new government they were creating, this tripartite government of legislature, executive, and judicial. Everybody was so focused because of their experience with King George and the tyranny that came from the throne, that their entire, most people's hairs and hackles were being raised over this executive question. And what they don't even realize is, where the main source of what I would call bad change, I know that's oversimplifying it, but the amount of change that happened to us that was of the worst didn't come from the president, the Oval Office, the White House, or the executive branch. It came from the court. It came from the judicial. And there was one gentleman who actually was trying to point this out during the Constitutional Convention. His name was, I think it was Judge Robert Yates. And he penned a couple of pamphlets then under the pseudonym of Brutus. And in one of them, he had written, "It is moreover of great importance to examine with care the nature and extent of the judicial power, because those who are to be vested with it are placed in a situation altogether unprecedented in a free country. No errors they commit can be corrected by any power above them, nor can they be removed from office for making so many erroneous adjudications." And then 2 months later, he wrote even more forcefully, Zen, quote, "There is no power above them to control any of their decisions. There is no authority that can remove them, and they cannot be controlled by the laws of the legislature. In short, they are independent of the people, of the legislature, and every power under heaven." Now listen to this. This is key. "Men placed in this situation will generally soon feel themselves independent of heaven itself."
Mm-hmm.
And if you read a book by a guy by the name of Ted Stewart, I think it was Ted Stewart, it's called Supreme Power. This book was a real eye-opener for me, sir, because this was all about 7 pivotal Supreme Court decisions that came from the bench, from these black robe activist judges. See, for the first 100 years, most of the judges that were entrusted with this high position of honor, where you were there for life and basically you couldn't even be removed, most of them were fairly honorable men that did their best to guard, self-check, and self-regulate themselves from touching anything that the founders included in the Constitution. Well, unfortunately, by the 1850s, with the Dred Scott decision and so many since, you started finding these politically activist judges that thought that, that old document, that old thing that was working so well for us, we need to modernize it. We need to catch it up with the times. And so they started making decisions that were far beyond their scope and what was entrusted to them. And it, law, it creates a precedent. And once that one precedent boulder gets shoved off the hill, it starts creating other itchy fingers to roll more rocks off the cliff, But
yeah, lifelong appointments. I mean, that's absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah, and I mean, there's other things like changing the Senate from the senators used to be elected by state legislature, and then with the 17th Amendment in the early 1900s, they changed it to now popular vote. Now, this is where I had a aha moment in 2020 when they made our current POTUS, the presumptive nominee, where all of a sudden it clicked in my brains then, because I used to gripe probably one too many times at my wife when I was actually watching the mainstream news media, which I don't dare do now. But, I was always that sort of sycophant jumping from CNN to MSNBC to Fox, and it drove my wife nuts because she's like, why are you watching those other stations? I can't stand it. But they would always, left or right, it didn't matter. You constantly heard them calling us a democracy. And I knew well enough to know that that's not what we were founded as. We were a constitutional republic, not a democracy. And in Zen Garcia's neighborhood, if you were living in a democracy, Zen, if your neighbors, the 51% decided that Zen's family had to go so the homeless guy down the street could move in, you're gone. That's a true democracy right there. Yeah. It's mob rule of the 51% over the 49%. But they would keep calling us this. And it was a mystery to me, brother, because I'm going, why do they keep calling us this, hammering this D word down everybody's ear hole when that is not what we are, at least not what we were. Right. And that's when it clicked, when they made JB what he is, because that was even bigger mystery to me. Not to get political here, but it was like, why would you run someone like that against a popular incumbent? It made zero sense. And that's when I felt like Father backhanded me across the back of my head going, are you ready to see what is so clearly right in front of you now, Bubba? And it was basically that voting and elections are a complete sham. It's theater to give the people an illusion that they have control. And I think Zen, circling back to my point, I think that is when and why they did what they did in the early 1900s with transitioning the Senate from state legislature vote, from the senators being popularly elected. I think they did a little switch of hands where they made the people think that they were getting more power, when in essence, they took what little power they did have, because the founders set it up to where only the House of Congress, the House of Representatives, was ever to be elected, its members elected by popular vote. Right. So I think that, it's my speculation, mind you, but my theory is that was probably around the time when because in my 20s, I felt like I wasn't being a good citizen by not voting. And so I told myself, even though I suspected what I'm telling you now, might be better to vote, because it would be better to vote and have it not count than not vote and end up having it count. Well, like I said, I've been reformed ever since, because I had that huge aha light bulb moment in 2020 where it was like, oh, this is why they want to hammer the D word down. Everybody, is to make everybody have this sense that they have the power, they have control, when in actuality, I think George Carlson had it correct. And it's like, it's a big club and you ain't in it.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. It's a dog and pony show, really. And
exactly.
The fact that there's only a two-party system here in the United States as well is also a travesty. And it's ridiculous that only Democrats and Republicans can get even funding to support their supposed, as far as their campaigns and all of that. All of that is a sham too, and it's only the reason that only them two get money to run their campaigns and to support their elections is because all that is controlled, and it's all contrived. Like I said, it's a dog and pony show. The left-right paradigm, all of that is false. It's controlled opposition, and so
correct. And it's by design. It's by design to pit us against each other, and it's way easier to control two groups set at odds than it is to have multiple groups set at odds. Right. Yeah. And that's why it's so important, I think, Zen, to remember our Civil War, because we were never more polarized, split down the middle, almost exactly 50-50 on an issue as we are today, or since 1861 as we are today. And I think that's important, why it's so imperative and would behoove us to go seek out and study that time period, because that 5 years of seething bloody hell where we decided as a country, as a society and a people that we were going to quit talking and start shooting at one another, we never recovered from that. There's good reason why I spend so much time on that war in the book, because I don't think we've been taught the truth of what happened and have come to faith. I think when that war ended, there was unfortunately, a lot of our ancestors that would just as soon have forgot about it, and that was dangerous, because what the parent and grandparent chose to forget and ignore didn't happen. The child and grandchild and great-grandchild, unfortunately, started resurrecting, which is why you see, so in my opinion, why you see so many monuments glorifying and the land being filled. But see, people look at the Washington Monument and Lincoln Memorial Zen, and they think that this stuff magically popped up in 1776, when in actuality, a lot of these suckers didn't even start appearing and getting erected until much later, in the late 1800s, early 1900s. In fact, when they wanted to bring Statue of Liberty here, there was a huge push to get it denied. There was a great segment of the population that was, they knew what that thing represented, and they said, hell no, we don't want it here. Our government did what it did anyway. Sure.
Hold on. We'll be right back, everyone, for a second hour.
As a bookstore for truth seekers, it's our goal to make ancient manuscripts which were once held captive by secretive institutions available for public consideration. In our generation, where wisdom has increased as Daniel the prophet foretold, we have access to many of the testimonies our early church brethren were persecuted for preserving. After being hidden for centuries, these manuscripts have been leaked from various sources throughout the earth, and it's our goal to gather these sources into printable form to make available for all who seek the ancient way. If you're looking to deepen your studies of the biblical narrative, find these ancient manuscripts and more at sacredwordpublishing.com.
Joined her Eliana and started dreaming of what life would be like with her, where we would take her, what we would teach her, and of course, what we would read to her. One day we walked around a bookstore looking for books we might want for her and found nothing, so we started brainstorming what exactly we would want. Even from a young age, we wanted her to know and understand the heart of God, and hidden truths that are in ancient biblical manuscripts like the Book of Enoch, and the idea of the Prophecy for Children series was born. Justin got hard to work, and Praise Yah released the Prophecy for Children series. We are grateful for the support and amazing feedback from others who have been wanting the same for their children. We just found out we will be having a son, and we are excited to grow our family and to keep writing books for our children to share with our truth-seeking family. To order these books today, please check out the children's store at sacredwordpublishing.com.
Your partnership with Sacred Word Publishing goes further than the publishing of ancient manuscripts and weekly video content.
You also make a huge impact across the earth in orphanages in Myanmar, India, Uganda, and Kenya.
Your support is crucial for the development of the ecclesia of real truth seekers.
We thank you for joining us in hosting Secrets Revealed, Momentary Zen, the Digital Readers Club, Ask Me Anything series, and other shows that have helped lead so many to the truth of salvation.
To become even more involved, please visit patreon.com/sacredwordpublishing, where you can partake in exclusive, interactive, patron-only content and help us continue shining the light of love in this darkened world.
Capital will ever treat us fairly. You are lying to yourselves because we know what they do, and we must fight back. You can torture us and bomb us. Fire is catching. And if we burn, you burn with us.
Good evening.
Are you awake yet? I hope. We've tried and we've tried for years and years to use passive resistance and loud voices to make a change. The time is over. Your governments around the world have no other goal than to decimate your entire existence at the hands of the bankers and the elites. The war is coming, and it's your choice to decide if you want to be a warrior or a victim. Denial is not a choice anymore. Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, the #1 listener-supported radio station on the planet. Not giving up. Revolution Radio, 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 radio. All right. Thanks for listening while we took that short break here at Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com. And now we're going to get back to your host.
All right. Welcome back, everybody. For our second hour, excuse me. I'm your host, Zen Garcia, and this is Momentary Zen. I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to you, brother, and then I'm going to get some water. I'll be right back.
Sure. Absolutely. Yeah, before the break, I was just basically trying to make it known to people that a lot of these monuments, these erected things of stone that you could go as far as calling them idols, if you will, certain ones especially that have very symbolic, allegorical meanings to them. But a lot of these didn't even pop up until a very specific time in our history, late 1800s, early 1900s, which is not ironic because what you'll find is this fascination for the darkness and the occult, if you will, immediately after the American Civil War, especially when you start talking about the late 1800s amongst certain elite circles. It was all the rave for, these ladies of wealth and means to have these spiritual parties. Even Mary Todd Lincoln would hold seances in the White House, which by the end of the war was driving her husband bonkers. He was not a fan of that at all. But yeah, it's just interesting to me, Zen, how you find the erection of a lot of these monuments, a reigniting of a pride in something that almost tore us completely into as a nation in the mid 1800s. By the late 1800s, to where you had obviously like the Daughters of the Confederacy and all these other groups that were starting to pay and fund the erection of a lot of these monuments by the early 1900s. And to me, I kind of wish people would have just had a more honest conversation of remembering what happened during those years instead of maybe celebrating and glorifying certain aspects of it that, if you and I, Zen, admitted that we had been completely duped and deceived about something, we wouldn't then celebrate that. We wouldn't be afraid to admit it and talk about it, but to, erect a monument to one's being completely deceived, it probably isn't a very good idea. But, it's kind of indicative of how our national heart slowly began to be poisoned, which is also ironic given that scripture says, blood will pollute your land. And we never had so much of a bloodletting on our soil, not even during the revolution, is what we experienced during the Civil War. So I find it, at least in the timing aspect, ironic that the one happened on the heels of the other within, and then you got Jim Crow laws that happened all across the South around this exact same time. So it's just that William Penn, I think it was, had written, if men will not be governed by God, they will be governed by tyrants. And I think we've seen that play out over the generations here, because human beings do not change.
Well, I think that part of, the thing of a lot of these sculptures, and even like with the thing of Albert Pike and the obelisk and even the Statue of Liberty, you have all this pagan ideology and idolatry coming in. And of course, this is being perpetuated by the elite, and they hide things in plain sight. And so they're celebrating in iconography things that most people don't remember, with regard to, like the Babylonian religions, even the Christmas tree, and the obelisk being a phallic symbol, and how those kind of things are celebrated in their connection to even what happened in the garden with the seduction of Eve, the whole eating of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That this is truly where the sons of Cain, the children of perdition, how they got their start, even here in this world. That Cain being of the wicked one, the whole theme of the apple, the obelisk, things like that, are a celebration of their how they were founded, and the progenitor, as far as Cain being, the patriarch of their whole bloodline. And so things like that are little understood, little known about, but again, everything's hidden in plain sight. And so a lot of these things are also to perpetuate the madness and to celebrate their victory over we the people. And that kind of stuff is ongoing in this day and age. You were talking about how the Civil War, this is even right now, the monuments and statues and things of that nature. It's a huge cause of strife in this day and age. And then we see that, the controlling of the left, right, and that controlled opposition, how it led to people taking up arms against one another. And it seems like, that kind of mentality is exactly where we are now. That there's so many people on the edge that it seems like every day, there's mass shootings. There's people that are just so fed up with the system and with the way things are, and for whatever reason, supporting left or right, whatever, they're just mad to the point where they want to just kill people and cause a scene and create turmoil, even at the expense of their own freedom and their own lives. And it's just madness. But we're seeing a resurgence of that. And so, but yeah, let me turn it back over to you. And if you would, let's go into that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with you, Zen. That I think the reason why they have been so successful, sir, in getting us pitted almost equally, even Steven, down the line of 50-50, polarizing two segments of society, which is what the entire left-right paradigm is all about. It's meant to achieve. It's kind of frightening to me, because I have studied that period of our history so in depth that the very thought that there would be people these days in our modern times just loosely, willy-nilly flinging around that idea of taking arms to fix our differences, our very drastically polarized opposite differences, it's disheartening, because I don't think I understand it, but I don't agree with it. The reason why I think that is done is because so many people know so little about the truth of what happened during those years.
They're being duped. They're being duped, just like people had been previously.
Correct. Because, like you said about hiding, they hide truth in plain sight with a lot of their symbolism, and the way what they show us, they rub it in our face. I talked to one individual who had ties with the nefarious, who he said that's actually a law of theirs. I don't know if this is true, but he said that that's actually a law of theirs, that they have to show us all the truth. They don't have to do it all at once, and they can give it to us in little pieces scattered and splattered throughout the course of time. But touching on what you're talking about, with they hide truth in plain sight right in front of our faces. You know why I think that is, brother? Because nobody wants to be that individual telling the emperor he's buck naked. Mm-hmm. That's why they play on our own sense of pride of not wanting to, try and point this stuff out, because if you do, as I'm sure and all your listeners know, if you try to point out some of the stuff that's staring people right in the face, what do you get labeled at right out the get-go? Conspiracy theorists.
Yeah, conspiracy theorists, right? Yeah.
And they coined that term, the I don't know if I can say the 3-letter acronym with the Gestapo that is YouTube and whatnot these days or not. But they coined that term after the JFK assassination in order to control anybody talking about a narrative about that assassination and murder. If it didn't follow the official story, the official narrative, they coined that term in order to box. They created that box so that they could shove anybody speaking truth in it. And obviously the ignorant masses would just hear the conspiracy theorist label and auto dismiss you as being a lunatic.
Right.
That's my understanding of what the whole Alex Jones purpose even is to have this ranting, raving person that looks like an insane guy who's mad, and he talks about the same things that we talk about, but now you've got that evil golem that has been constructed by them that they can then auto label all the rest of us as.
Exactly. Yeah,
and then they
make us look nuts, and then it also for the majority, the masses, they will automatically shut down when they hear those two words, and they think of anybody that would consider conspiracy theories or conspiracy realities. That's the lunatic fringe. Those are the crazy ones,
Right.
They need to be locked up and medicated.
Well, we got to have some humility here and an open mind to realize that maybe, just maybe, what we've been taught and told for years is not entirely stable, is not entirely the truth. Maybe, I'm not saying it's all lies. They've done a great deal of that. There's been a great deal of lying, particularly in the last 100 years, with various false narratives about things that happened with Pearl Harbor and the Gulf of Tonkin and other events of those we won't speak of 20 years ago, which was huge for me, because I actually that one was very, as I write in the book, that whole event that happened in South Manhattan, that affected me, because that was history I lived, not necessarily the day it happened, but immediately afterward. And I will never, ever, sir, forget the smell in those subway tunnels. It is a smell that most veterans who have ever been in combat would probably be able to recognize. But anyway, my whole point is, obviously they have done a great deal of lying to us, but we have to have the humility and open mind to try and pick apart the truth from their lies.
Yeah, absolutely, because they always give us an official story, but the official story is all propaganda. And you mentioned, World War II and the Gulf of Tonkin, which are both false flag events, as was 9/11. And so in your studying of history, you learned pretty much, that government sponsored terror, that they create the boogeyman. Did you go into like the Operation Northwoods, any of that? How they were willing to, even to blow up the Apollo missions and to blame it on terrorists and these kind of
I
things.
do.
I mean, this is the official position of the U.S. government at that time, the Joint Chiefs of Staff. These are the leaders of the country that decide and create, reasons to go to war. Can you talk about some of that?
Yeah, I
Because it's
do
so
make
important.
mention about, sure. Well, because it literally it steered so much of what happened then to what we now
Exactly.
see now. What we're
Right.
living now is basically the unholy birth child of what they were up to and doing back then.
Exactly.
And I do bring up and make mention of various things like MK Ultra, like the Manhattan Project, and Operation Fishbowl and High Jump and all sorts of these things. I don't believe I went into Northwoods in depth. I think I was still sort of looking into that at the time I even hit that. But yeah, there's all of these. Unfortunately, from what I understand, is we underwent a massive unholy facelift at the conclusion of World War II, where we started doing some very, very unethical, immoral things that our ancestors would have balked at and would have never touched with a 10-foot pole. Just some examples. There was obviously you had Dr. Mengele doing what he did and the research he was involved in heavily with twinning and genetic research and all of that at Auschwitz.
Right.
But you also had a Japanese sect of researchers and scientists attached to what was called Unit 731. And this is just one example of some very shady, nefarious things that happened at the conclusion of World War II, where we as a country started to really sort of just put our conscience in the freezer, if you will. Well, basically, when Japan surrendered, I believe it was General Douglas MacArthur made a deal with the devil and basically said, we will give all of you scientists attached to Unit 731, immunity. In exchange, you turn over to us all of your research. And I won't get into the gory detail here over this live stream. People can read it in the appropriate chapter if they'd like. But what these Japanese scientists were doing were horrendous. The experiments that they were conducting. And basically they took that deal, and the US government got all of the research results and all of their data from their various experiments in exchange for immunity. And obviously, we haven't even touched on the whole UFO and all of that business that was going on around then too. So it's just it's not good. But if we're going to face what we see today, we're going to have an honest conversation with ourselves of what happened back then. And obviously, the enemy's agents are always at it to try and over embellish and sort of spin false things into even the conspiracies out there. You and I probably can point to certain conspiracies, Zeitgeist being one of them, and other things where they use the truth seekers that get wise to the fact that we've been lied to, and then they try to create this whole other ditch on the other side of that ditch for you to fall into.
Right. Yeah, because
the enemy does. But
that whole thing now is the Ancient Alien, that whole the History Channel. That the extraterrestrials created us, and that they were the ones that jumped the gun on evolution. It's still, to them, evolution, and though intelligent design, there's not a supreme being involved in the creation, but the fallen angels that were cast out of the heavens, they are the demonic influence that is now being attributed as creating us, and that they're the ones also are going to come and save us from ourselves in the in the end. And all this is being set up as part of the coming reign of the Antichrist, which the Bible also speaks about as strong delusion. But yeah, so we're only got like 30 minutes left or so. I want to give you a chance to cover all of the important things that you talk about in your book so that people can get more familiar with, what you write about. Because how many pages is your book? It's quite extensive.
I think we were pushing somewhere around almost 500 by the end of it. That's kind of one reason why I opted to go with a larger size book. That way, what I didn't want, I may have just shot myself in the foot by trying not to shoot myself in the other foot. I didn't want to go with like your standard 5x9 size book, brother, because I didn't want the spine of the thing to be so thick that it was going to scare somebody away of this big, thick book. And I didn't want to break it up like the publishers had suggested, because I didn't really write the narrative to be broken up like that. I didn't want, somebody buying book 2 without going through the journey that was book 1 first type of thing. But that's why we opted for going with the 8.5 by 11. I think it actually accidentally ended up being 12 size. But yeah, we're pushing about 500 pages. If I could do it again, we would reformat this sucker because of the size of it and the font of the text. It kind of ends up a little bit difficult to track from line to line. But yeah, I mean, I guess my attempts, sir, was just to try and share as much of the interesting information that I was finding through my various readings of people far smarter than I, far more learned and wiser historians. And I'm not a historian. I'm just a history buff. That was my passion. And, when I wasn't working or doing stuff, that I was reading. And I just developed a taste and desire and hunger for wanting to learn these people's stories and what happened that brought us to this point. And it's just so interesting and fascinating to find. You start seeing that there's a through line and a vein here where there's two spiritual forces, I think, literally trying to jockey and make power grabs at trying to steer what we were from our inception to where we are now. I think it was Chuck Missler has a great quote in one of his videos where he says, "Scripture is full of Satan plotting and scheming and God outsmarting." And it's kind of interesting because that's exactly what I would say has been going on with us in our past for the, previous 250 some odd years. But there's all these really interesting occurrences, and where, especially meteorologically speaking, however you pronounce that, where, with Washington leaving Long Island, and ironically, right when the British forces has his entire force backed into a corner on Long Island, you have everyday citizens flocking to the tip with their own personal little John boats, and right when the British are getting ready to pounce on what's left of Washington's contingent, there is an unseasonable fog that sits over this specific area of Long Island while Washington is evacuating his forces under cover of this fog. It was even rumored that his soldiers could see it was bright, clear sky sunlight in Manhattan, not 2 miles away. And that's just one of them. Another could be pointed at on the Battle of Fredericksburg, where there is this interesting little phenomenon. Here, let me just find it real quick. And if you don't mind, I'll just read this little portion, if I can find it here real quick. Because it's just one example of these really interesting, fascinating events that transpired in these various time periods during our conflicts, and not just the conflicts, but see if I can't find it. Sorry.
Hey, you're fine.
Gettysburg's another one. A lot of people don't know this, but there is a local Indian lore that said that a great bloody battle between the native tribes happened at this very same exact spot the early settlers were told this by the natives long before the Civil War even commenced. And then they got their whole entire tale about the Devil's Den. I don't know if people aren't familiar with Gettysburg. There's these giant truck-sized boulders all piled up that got called the Devil's Den because the local natives had a legend that there was a big, huge black snake that lived under these boulders and would pass from the inner earth to the surface of the earth through these boulders. And ironically, the natives had labeled it the devil. But
Interesting.
Anyway, right after one of the major battles of Fredericksburg, there was, let's see here, where should I pick this up? The Aurora Borealis, which is very rarely seen. This is page 103, if anybody wants to follow along with me at the very top. Very rare, which is rarely seen that far south in the latitude of Fredericksburg, Virginia, danced its bright and wondrous colors across the sky above the battlefield. Some people believe an unusually powerful solar flare in 1862 caused the brilliant display that night. Given what had happened the day before, I like to think one could come up with a better explanation than that. As the frigid night was solidifying red blood to the ground, the powers of the air slowly licked their bright green tongues over the freezing and dying. What are the chances of all three of these factors lining up simultaneously? Number one, the Aurora Borealis over Fredericksburg, Virginia. Number two, the same day over the site of a major battle snuffing out thousands of lives. And number three, and many of those lives lost were dead Irishmen staring lifelessly up at a bright green kaleidoscope in the Virginia night sky. At that one moment, over 200,000 men were gathered that night looking up in wonder. Consider this, such a display has never been witnessed at that latitude in the last 150 years or remembered prior to that 1862 December day. I don't know what to make of that, but I find it interesting. Another line I confess I shamelessly stole from one Chuck Missler. That line just always is such a great way to wrap some of this stuff up. But another really interesting tale about Fredericksburg Zen that I won't read the entire account is basically how the very field that a lot of these Irishmen fighting both for the Confederacy and the Union died in a field that years prior, corn had been raised in this field. And the owner of this field where this battle happened years afterward donated a whole lot, if not the entire crop that year of corn from Fredericksburg, Virginia to the starving Irish because of the potato famine that had happened that year. And I sort of just romantically speculated, what are the chances? These are like history's mysteries that I just find so fascinating. What are the chances that a life that had been saved by Virginia corn being shipped to Ireland, that same life hopped on a boat, came over to America on the eve of the Civil War and ended up fighting and dying in the very same field that they were saved by? There's just so many of these types of stories. And that's kind of what I try to focus on in the book is making history fascinating enough that people want to read it and learn about it, because I think the sooner we get up to speed as a society and a country on what happened, and the more the enemy's agents is going to have a harder time pulling the wool over our eyes and getting us to constantly fall into the same traps and pitfalls and snares that they lay ahead of us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely agreed. Because, again, you even like reading the history of the Bible and the supernatural manner in which the Most High has used individuals or angels to save his people when facing complete annihilation. I mean, those kind of things, especially in the history of the wars, it just shows that, the Most High is guiding and intervening and acting upon in order that a certain outcome is brought about. Because in my opinion, he is controlling all of history for his own prophetic end. And that's the the most intriguing thing with regard to history for me is just like, Daniel's vision of the statue of the empires that would come up, and that these empires would span, the whole duration of the Second World Age. That even now we are still fulfilling the prophecy that Daniel saw the statue and telling Nebuchadnezzar, and that the beast kingdom, at the end of days, and the New World Order, all of that coming about, it's exactly where we are. I mean, even the blooming of the fig tree, which, is a situation that never happened ever in the history of the world, where a nation was reborn 2,000 years and then had the same capital that it had in the previous time. And for me, that the whole theme of the blooming of the fig tree, I'm not sure if you're familiar with that prophecy, but Christ mentions this in Matthew 24, Luke 21, Mark 13, the Apocalypse of Peter. And for me, that's without a doubt a sign that we are that generation that is seeing and watching and recognizing the signs of the seasons and the fulfillment of all prophecies.
Yeah, I don't know for sure one way or another. I would be inclined to agree with you that the chances seem pretty likely, because there seems to be an awful lot of very interesting prophecy being fulfilled. And I can't remember where it was in Enoch that it talks about. Is it a particular week or generation or something that sounds, it smacks an awful lot of what we're seeing now and today. I believe it's also in Second Esdras where it talks about
absolutely.
A country or society or a power that rises up. And when you read whatever, I'm horrible with addresses. I could find it eventually, but I'm not going to tie up dead air with that. But it talks about, obviously, when you read that chapter, it just, and I'm sure you'd agree when you read Jeremiah, Isaiah, and some of these other books. If you didn't know any better, you'd swear it was talking about us. I read a really interesting book one time in 2000, I think it was 15, by a gentleman called Martin Whittick, and this book is called The Third Reich. And I am not kidding you, brother. I read this book and I didn't know, and this is during Obama's presidency, mind you, in 2015. I'm reading, I think it may have even been 2014. I'm reading this book called The Third Reich, and it's all about the Germany in the 1930s and the rise of the Third Reich. And over and over, I couldn't tell you how many pages I didn't know if I was reading about Germany in the 1930s then or modern day America.
Right.
We're following literally we're marching down the exact same path. And that's what's so disheartening and frightening. Now, thankfully, Father seems to be waking a lot of people up in mass and big time. I think the enemy and his agents are trying to convince us that we're loners and all alone, and there is no one like us. We're just crazy lunatics. But I think the more people that study our history, that are reading the scriptural books that you're talking about, and just the better we're going to be to either inhabit or at least slow some of the evil designs that have been laid out as a snare in front of us, because an ignorant people are just going to step right in that bear trap. And that seems to be what we've been at for a while, which is why they wanted our parents and grandparents just completely distracted. This is exactly what we saw play out in the Roman Empire, as I make mention, I think either in my conclusion or somewhere around there, where it talks about, the senators, as the Roman Empire was literally falling to pieces, its economy was in shambles. The senators, it was the whole bread and circus deal. They were doing backroom deals, selling out their country to the highest bidder, while they kept and ramped up the games in the Colosseum. And they're doing the same thing now, where they're just trying to keep everybody distracted with their little black scrying mirrors and keep us from getting wise to the history and the knowledge that we need to have, that Father is always putting. How many times do we read, Zen, in the Tanakh where God tells his people to remember. In fact, he commanded them to remember the entire Exodus event, for crying out loud. So if he's making commandments where he's demanding his people remember their history, it tells me it's pretty darn important for people to do just that,
Yeah, I mean, the whole theme of the Passover was made a memorial forever, so we wouldn't forget. And the same thing with the incarnation of Christ and how he was the Passover lamb. I mean, there is a complete connection with the coming of the Son and how he fulfilled the Father's feast. And, the whole theme of history and the knowledge of the past, it's so important because we find ourselves repeating. And the people, if you don't recognize, you're duped in the same way as we had been previously. And so that's why it's, again, important to understand the true nature of history, because even going back to World War II, we were talking about, false flags and how this event also, when you come to understand the truth of what happened, how the radar detection was removed from Alaska, that they were allowed to succeed in their destruction of the Pacific Fleet, just so that Eisenhower could lead us into war and have us join the Allies in their war against the Axis powers. But most people don't know or understand that, or how the Gulf of Tonkin incident was said to never have happened in the way that it was reported. And this was by the NSA themselves, who, came out and told the truth about those events in that particular time. And so if people that don't understand their history, they don't understand the truth, even with 9/11, which obviously, looking at the events of that day, it could not have occurred in the way that it was reported in mainstream media, and that the official story is, again, another one of those dog and pony shows. But if you would, please continue to tell us about your book, your writings, the things you've learned, because 500 some odd pages, even a 2-hour show is not enough time to cover even half or a fifth of all that you've wrote about and covered in your work. So
yeah, there's a lot to cover, brother. There is a whole lot of time and people and generations and things that occurred from the time of our inception till now. And like I said, I left out entire chunks of periods of our history that I love personally and fascinated with, because the sucker already ended up way longer than I ever anticipated it would ever be. But you're exactly right with what you're talking about, with the Gulf of Tonkin and Pearl Harbor and all these other things. It's kind of, they may be evil, but they tend to reuse what works. And when they've got an ignorant people that
Right.
don't know their past, they don't have to come up with new and inventive, clever things to do. They will and have, but they tend to just use the same tactics and things that have worked in the past for them, because everybody just forgets. Everybody knows those who don't remember their past are doomed to repeat the mistakes of that past.
Exactly,
And that's kind
yes.
of where we find ourselves. That was the whole motivation of why I chose to write the book to begin with, is I thought if I could try and write a narrative that seemed more interesting, that got people interested in wanting to study our past, then the various evil, nefarious agents of the enemy would have a harder time doing what they have been doing so well, it seems, with our parents and grandparents, which is having them distracted. I'm not really great at, I'm no prophet, but I can sort of sometimes smell what they're doing before they do it, or at least what they're going to do. Like 2 years ago is a perfect example. But when you like, I read a book called Merchants of Despair by I think it's Zubrin. What was his name? Hang on, let me grab it. It is Robert Zubrin wrote a book called Merchants of Despair, and it's all about how these people operate, how they worship the earth, and what their goals are. You've been to the Georgia Guidestones. I need not tell you, Zen, about any of this stuff. But they tend to do the same thing over and over so much that when you read and learn and study and study enough history, you can actually start to anticipate what they're going to do. It's a lot harder to figure out when and figure out how they're going to do it. Like, I can usually smell what they're going to do, but I don't know when they're going to do it or how they're going to do it type of business. Especially these last 2 years, it's kind of getting scary in that regard. But the whole point of the book, I guess, was just to show that, hey, look, there's a whole lot going on here that has happened that either we've been completely duped and lied to, or they're making it uninteresting to keep you away from actually wanting to go do your own digging and your own research. And I kind of found myself sort of in the same place, I guess, Rob may have been, and this quote stuck with me in his book, Babylon Rising, when he wrote, quote, "Often when a paradigm shift in belief patterns happens, there is a grieving process. Part of that process can involve anger, depression, and even anxiety until we finally reach acceptance. But I believe when God reveals truth to us, we are responsible to share it." And I take that quote very seriously, because I guess I just found myself one day in early 20, I think it just New Year's, it just happened in 2018, feeling like I had a truth or a story to share with people that they needed to hear, because it felt like the only other options were fiction or dry, dusty textbooks that are, to me, the publishers are writing intentionally to make our American past just seem boring. And that's why all of the youth, it's not presented in a way that should be fascinating, which is what it is,
Yeah.
But yeah, we could talk, you and I could have an entire hour's conversation on some of these official narratives that weren't entirely honest regarding Pearl Harbor, how they stripped the island of its entire defenses. And then when they knew Roosevelt, FDR's administration had been given cables that the Japanese were about to attack, and they purposely did nothing. And then when the attack happened, they blamed it on the two commanding generals on that island. Which is kind of messed up. But then, the Gulf of Tonkin, like you said, it didn't even happen. Even Lyndon B. Johnson, as I write in the book, was supposedly quipped to one of his aides, "Oh, those stupid soldiers were just shooting at fish, flying fish," But it's these types of things that when we have an honest, open-minded, honest come to, whatever moment with ourselves, when we have the humility to admit that maybe we have been duped and deceived, and you go search all the evidence of what happened, and you start to see, because when 9/11, I always sort of stayed away from the 9/11 truther type stuff, because I, like many others, it was almost too overwhelming a thought to even go there in one's brain and psyche, that your government could have perpetuated such a horrific event. And meanwhile, you had all of these truth tellers, because I didn't know what I was watching that morning, and I watched the entire affair. But there was a great deal of professional demolitionists and engineers and others that did know what they were seeing and did know what happened. And I never investigated any of their papers, any of their research or evidence that they were bringing forth in the years proceeding, because I was guilty of doing the exact same thing, which is not rolling up my sleeves and doing the due diligence to go investigate a matter in its entirety. I got duped into, saying, well, they're just crazy. But the funny thing is when you start researching architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth and all of these other people that are presenting alternative evidence about a great many of what you and I would call, false propaganda and whatnot, you'll find that if you honestly analyze all of the data and the evidence, and you use the good logic and reason and mental powers that Father's blessed us with, you'll find that if you have two shelves and you start stacking up the bricks of evidence for the official narrative versus maybe some of the alternative evidence, you'll find one shelf starting to bow under the weight of the amount of bricks. And I think it's on us to just deal with that, to have a truthful assessment of it all and realize what it means, what it portends, and to just be honest about what's right in front of us, which is why sadly there still seems to be so many of us that are almost ignoring and pretending like what's going on right in front of our face isn't even happening, which is just sad to me, because it's not going to go away because you pretend it's not there, and that's
Right.
particularly one thing that's been especially these last 2 years, for me, Zen. It's been difficult, because when you spend as much time immersed in our past and you really know who we once were as a people, it's kind of almost near depressing to see who we become.
Yes.
However,
Yes.
that being said, while it's depressing to see the type of people we have become, I'm trying like crazy to have hope that there's people waking up and Father's bringing to the truth of what is going on in our nation, and hopefully we can start to fight back in whatever way that looks like. I don't know if the ship is salvageable or not at this point. I suspect and wonder some days if we're not under severe judgment, because we got that sign in 2017 and another in 2024,
Mm-hmm.
and Jeremiah
Right.
6 is really hammering on a guy these days. So I don't know what our future portends or what it looks like, but we're still here.
Yeah. Well, whatever that history or whatever the reality of what we're going to be contending with in the future, I take the whole Ezekiel 33, the watchman on the wall, that parable very seriously. And I do believe that for those of us, as Rob said, when you come to know truth, you have a responsibility to share it, to sound the shofar, to blow the trumpet, and to give people a chance. Otherwise, their blood is upon us, the blood of the innocents, for not shouting from the rooftops the truth that we've come to understand and discernment. And so we are held to accountability, whether you're going to whether people decide to stand up and to become one of those that sounds the alarm and gives people a chance to assimilate those truths and that discernment, to take it upon themselves to affect a change upon their own lives and that of their families, to take precaution, to understand the true crisis and nature of the war that we find ourselves in, because it's a extreme hatred, enmity between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. The devil truly has a progeny that is willing to even abuse their own children. I mean, it's sick and twisted, but this is the kind of normalization that they do. And if they would harm their own children, what does that say for the rest of us? They would have no second thought at the slaughter of the innocents, at starting wars that are unnecessary in order to achieve an agenda, whatever that may be. And a lot of times we don't understand that. And we give people the benefit of the doubt. We think everybody has, the goodwill and the common interest of humanity at heart and in mind. But that's not the truth of it. There is a very organized evil here on the earth. And one must recognize and acknowledge that there is this people group here that are willing to, sell out their mothers and their fathers and their grandmothers and grandfathers and their children, and even their own spouses, in order to get ahead in whatever way they see benefit. And so, but we've got a few minutes remaining, so let me turn it back over to you. And if you would share with us more of the themes of your book. What are some of the other things that you wrote about, and how far does it go? Do you bring it up to the times that we are at now?
Yeah, so once we get past the 9/11 chapters, basically, obviously the war on quote unquote terror and the invasion of Iraq and various other things, it starts to take a little bit different of a narrative from what it was the previous 3/4 of it. Start going into a little bit more social aspects and what that looks like, and different various things that have been that were going on, at least in 2017, 2018, that I try to show how all of this is just it's kind of organized chaos and meant to be so, to keep everybody's head spinning.
Order out of chaos.
Right, and that's kind of their MO. They got to create that chaos in order to then present the order that everybody will clamor and want, whereas without it, nobody would want to sell or buy those stinky goods. It's also the whole, antithesis, thesis, and synthesis, the Hegelian dialectic. But
yes,
the problem is,
problem,
as
reaction,
I see it,
solution.
Right. And one of the big problems is, and I write this somewhere, what one generation tolerates, the next will embrace. And that's kind of what we have seen. We've committed suicide by tolerance in so many aspects of our society, where in being played for the better angels of our nature, as Lincoln would say, we were preyed upon of just wanting to be good to each other, but we ended up going and drifting into being a type of culture and society that we were never intended to be, and I would argue we never were before, but we ended up here because of hyper tolerance. And like you just said, we have this aspect where we want everybody, or we have this mindset where we think everybody is as benevolent and generous and kind-hearted and loving as what we are, but that's just not reality. There is very much a group of individuals that view this entire reality realm as a prison, and they want to be the wardens and keep us all as prisoners, and they very much have a driven agenda from their commanders and captains and chieftains in order to subjugate and to bring us all to heel. There's a particular oath of that militaristic order of their Central V Command in Italy, that when people read a book by Bill Hughes called The Secret Terrorists, it basically, like you had just said, Zen, about them turning on their own family and turning on their own, doing very wicked, evil things to their own children, mind you, which is even more against nature, at least nature that you and I would say came from our Father and Creator. They basically have an oath that you read in that book where they're willing to do anything on order of their general, that it almost insists on their conscience taking a back seat regardless of the task or what it is that is put in front of them to do. And that's sort of what they've been up to with us in our country for 250 years, which is to do whatever, I forget what, it's like an 80s show, I think, where he's like, I will use both any means fair and unfair to trip you up. It's kind of what they've been doing, where they use this oath that they swear to then do very great evils in order to guide us, the masses, and steer the masses right off a cliff. And it's like remember how during, a certain person's presidency, how the moniker was always being chanted, moving forward. Well, it's like, well, if you're in a herd of buffalo moving forward right off the buffalo jump, moving forward is not a great idea. You might want to stop and turn around and go back the way you came. But so the book basically brother, after 9/11, it just starts going into some social aspects, and then I try to wrap it up with what it all means, at least from a spiritual health. If you take a barometer health reading of our spiritual health as a society, we're sick, and we've been sick for a very, very long time, longer than I think we want to admit.
I
and I
agree,
think
brother.
it's
It's unfortunate.
Yeah, it is. It really is. Like I said, because once you know who we were, it's very unfortunate, and it's a sad day indeed to fully recognize what we've become. And we didn't get here overnight. This is not something that just over the course of a short amount of time, even though it does seem that we've undergone massive change in just a generation or two. However, it's by design, both in the nefarious and both with he that you and I would definitely say he uses all things for his purpose and good. And no matter what they do, they're not going to get around his plans. But hopefully we're found in favor of doing right instead of wrong in order to hamper their plans and not his. So,
hey, brother, it was good speaking with you, man. Enjoyed the
you
show.
too, boss. Hey, thank you so much for having a guy on and for caring. Appreciate it.
You're welcome. Be blessed all. Good night. Shalom.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us for this video and this broadcast. We appreciate all of you and thank you for your patronage. Please do like and subscribe and share with your friends. God bless all of you in your seeking.